How often have we heard this, that there are no battles to fight anymore, no mountains to climb, no new lands to discover, that there are no achievements to be had since all that was worthwhile doing has already been done by men who had righteous things to do, things that had to be done by men in the past, and by men who were, it seems, superior to us, men who were stronger, braver, more idealistic, and just plain better than us. Were they better? It does seem so. The evidence is all there. The evidence of the world wars in particular is everywhere in our consciousness. The seemingly pointless slaughter of the lions, who willingly and dutifully went to their oblivion, sent by the donkeys in the trenches of the Somme in the first, and the incomparable brilliance of the greatest generation in the second, seem only to bring our own relatively bland ordinariness into sharper focus. Their deeds, which were so necessary and so heroic, embarrass us and prevent us from ever comparing ourselves to them. They died so that we might live. And for what? Why did they die? Why did they choose to fight, to kill and to die? Well, it's not for me to say, but if I had to guess, it would be so that we wouldn't have to do what they had to do. Although even that's probably not exactly right. Because if they hadn't done what they did, we may still not have had to do those things. Because they could have chosen not to fight. They could have chosen not to fight the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese. They could have sat back and instructed their governments to make a deal. They could have said to Chamberlain or Churchill or even Lord Halifax, "You know, it was only 20 years ago that we fought the Germans, and although we won, it was a bloodbath, and we don't want to go through that again. So do a deal, make peace with Hitler. Let him keep that chunk of Czechoslovakia, and if he wants it, and try and look the other way if he attacks Poland. If we don't get in his way, he may just attack the Russians, and that would do us no harm. But whatever you do, don't start another bloody war." They could have done that, and who'd have blamed them? We lost getting on for 1 million men in the First World War stopping the Germans, the French even more, and Russia more than that, to say nothing of the Germans themselves. So they could have taken that option. There were many who argued that we should have, and still some even argue it today. But they didn't take it. They didn't take the understandably easy way out. They took the hard way. They took the right way. And I'm sure they took the hard way because it was the right way. They, the ordinary public, were almost certainly nowhere near as informed as we are today. And yet, despite that, somehow they still knew what the right course of action was. Churchill was, of course, instrumental in conveying that truth and translating the dangers through his radio broadcasts. In an age of digital media, our view of the right path is inevitably more complex, and maybe that is working in our favour, but maybe it isn't. Maybe more information only clouds the issues. Some would say that Churchill was a warmonger, and as a man of action he certainly relished his martial destiny. But the British nation followed him. They followed him into the valley of death. Of course he didn't personally do any of the fighting, but he was no stranger to combat, and he also laughably planned to go ashore on D-Day before wiser heads got the king to pull rank on him. In the First World War, after the catastrophe of Gallipoli, for which he was largely blamed, as penance, he resigned from the government, bought himself a commission, and served on the Western Front. Imagine that happening today. Imagine a cabinet minister like Michael Gove or Nick Clegg going to serve in Afghanistan in disgrace. Instinctively, people followed him because of such qualities. They sensed, I think, that he wouldn't ask them to do what he wouldn't. Similarly, in the United States, after the Japanese attacked the fleet at Pearl Harbor, It was within the range of choices that the Americans had to choose not to escalate the attack into a full-scale world war. America was comfortable and beginning to get richer again after the Depression. Hawaii was US territory, but it was not yet a fully fledged state. The Pacific Fleet was dealt a devastating blow, and America's blood was up for revenge, which was also understandable. And had Germany not declared war on the US a few days later, the Americans could have chosen to ignore the war in Europe and concentrate all their considerable weight on beating Japan. They could have done that, but they recognised something similar and dangerous in the aggression of both Germany and Japan that had to be met head on. It was Admiral Yamamoto who opined almost immediately after his attack at Pearl, "All I fear we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a fearsome resolve." But it might have served the Germans better had they considered the same. And what of the Empire? Why did they get involved? As Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa were all self-governing dominions which were, in effect as near as damn it, independent countries, there was no need for them to come to the aid of the mother country. And yet, come they did. They came and fought and killed and died in the Battle of Britain. On the beaches of Dieppe, in the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of New Guinea, and as starving prisoners of war building the Burma Railway. Why didn't they sit it out? The Canadians in particular were threatened by nobody, had been attacked by nobody, and feared nobody, and yet 40,000 of them perished in a war that wasn't theirs. For the non-white, non-self-governing dominions like India and much of the West Indies, their choice was made for them, but even here there were many tens of thousands who signed up willingly. My guess is that they too recognised something darker and more sinister even than their colonial masters. So they, the war generation, the greatest generation, are beyond reproach. Certainly it seems impossible for any of us to compare ourselves to any of them. Who of us would even dare? But maybe we should, or at least we should perhaps entertain the possibility that we could be like them. After all, if we could ask them what we should do, what do you think they might say? As a Brexiteer, it is tempting to think that they would be on my side. I think I have fairly solid reasons for arguing that, but I don't know that. But what I do suspect is that in any case, they wouldn't advise us to avoid the fight. We can assume fairly reliably that they fought fascism so that we wouldn't have to. But I don't honestly think we can interpret that as suggesting that we should never make a stand about anything, just in case it might lead to war. In fact, it was initially British avoidance of the fight in the policy of appeasement, along with Russian duplicity and American isolationism, that actually led to war in the first place. Of course, this Brexit, isn't actually a real conflict yet, and we should all hope that it doesn't get to be one. But if we want something, we need to be at least prepared to fight for it. This may not be a shooting war, but it is a fight, and if we want it, we do have to fight for it, tooth and nail, down to the wire, never giving up. We should take as an example those guys who really were in a shooting war. They didn't give up. They didn't take the easy path. They didn't avoid the fray. And what's more important, they did what they did without knowing whether or not they would be victorious. And that's an underrated aspect of courage. It always has been. Once victory has been achieved, it's very easy to imagine that it was always going to happen, that it was inevitable. But nothing is inevitable until it has happened. Until then, it was only one of several possibilities. So we should not only be prepared to fight, to join the fray and to get what we want, but we must also be prepared to fail. Although even that's not quite right. We should accept that we could fail, which is a little different. Getting Brexit is not inevitable, but then neither is remaining. These are two possibilities. There are also two likely possibilities, which is kind of strange. We don't know yet which one will be the outcome, but it depends on us. It depends on us wanting Brexit more than the other side not wanting it. When we voted, we showed that we did want it, but we didn't show how much we wanted it. We thought that by expressing our wishes, that it would be so. We all had such faith in the honesty and decency of our institutions. And we did have faith, otherwise we wouldn't have bothered, that we thought that our wish was their command. Well, it wasn't, was it? And so far we have been patient, too patient. In fact, our patience has emboldened the Remain side. They have taken our patience as acquiescence. They have taken our patience as proof that we don't really want this. They have taken our patience as proof that we don't want Brexit as much as they want Remain. And it has to be said, and believe me, I don't like saying it, but they have put up a pretty good fight. They're wrong, of course. Of course they're wrong. They're wrong democratically. They're wrong morally. They're wrong technically. And they might even be wrong practically. But that doesn't seem to stop them. One of my favourite quotes, and one I've used before, is from Malcolm X. To repeat it again for anyone who's not heard it, he said, "You get what you want by letting your enemies know you'll do anything to get it. Then you'll get it. It's the only way you'll get it." Our opponents have done all sorts of reasonable things to show that they want the UK to remain within the EU. They've gone on marches that are much bigger than ours. Of course, most Remainers are from London and the South East, so going on a demo is much easier if you live in Camden or Tunbridge Wells or Maidenhead than if you had to come from Morecambe or Barry or Newton Abbot. But they are going on them, and their marches dwarf ours. Their supporters in the media have used their platforms to broadcast their message on radio, on television and in the print media. It may seem unfair to us, but it's hardly unreasonable behaviour. But it's in the unreasonable things that they have done that really shows their Malcolm X-like level of commitment to their cause. They have used their positions as MPs to block and stymie and obfuscate the democratic mandate. They have used Parliament not as a tool for the people, which is what it is there for, but as a weapon against the people, which it is not. They have used their privileged position to elect themselves as super citizens whose judgment carries far more weight than ours as normal private citizens. They have used their private wealth to distort and warp the law to bend it to their own ends. They have captured our most democratic institution and exploited the law of unintended consequences to turn it into nothing more than a wrecking ball in order to prevent the natural readjustment of a general election, when a government cannot govern without an input from its legitimate master, the British people. They have been unreasonable in their actions. The MPs in particular have, as we all know, also been illegitimate, undemocratic, unworthy, craven, unjust, mendacious and venal, not to say also deeply unpatriotic and downright treacherous, in their collaboration with what is in essence a foreign power. To say that their behaviour has been disgusting is somewhat of an understatement, but this is not what we should focus on. What we should focus on is the fact that they have been prepared to do all of these things, and in doing so they have shown themselves not to be the custodians of democracy that we might reasonably have expected, considering, apart from anything else, that we, rich and poor alike, have furnished them, via our taxes, with an enviable and sumptuous lifestyle of at least £79,000 a year, plus expenses, for even the most idle and unengaged backbencher. But leaving the money to one side for a moment, we should also be focusing on what they have been prepared to sacrifice in order to prevent Britain from leaving the EU. Being an MP is, and should be, an honour. It is an honour to serve as an MP, so we are told. And as such, being an MP comes with a fair chunk of prestige. Although our MPs are not quite one in a million, they are literally 1 in 100,000. So even if most of us have never heard of most of our MPs, and if some of us struggle to name even our own, there must be something more than the fat salary that attracts people to the lofty position of passing laws and telling the rest of us how we should live. For the most ambitious, that something is power. And those who seek power over all other things are just a different breed from the rest of us. But for the rank and file MPs, as if there is ever such a thing as rank and file in such an exclusive club, that thing is prestige, or esteem, or status in the eyes of us, the hoi polloi, the masses, the great unwashed. They want to be venerated in our eyes. They want us to believe that they are, in fact, the guardians of our hallowed democracy. You'd think that that would be something valuable, maybe even invaluable, something that they want to hold on to. You'd think that they want to protect that. You'd think that they wouldn't want to sacrifice it. But sacrifice it they have. So you have to wonder why they have. You have to wonder why they no longer care that we don't venerate them, even if we ever did. Of course, many people never did, but it was a fiction that they could always tell themselves. But that illusion has now been sacrificed, and in plain sight for all of us to see. The mask has not only slipped, but been ripped off, and yet they seem not to care. How can they see themselves as anything other than the anti-democratic tyrants that they are? Why are they so relaxed about allowing us to see them for how they really are? Why? I can't answer that exactly. I can't look inside their heads to see their motivations, but I can see, as we all can, that they are prepared to do all of these things in order to prevent this country from leaving the European Union. They have demonstrated, in a way that we haven't, that they are prepared to do anything to get what they want. Whenever I pose this question, the why, many people tell me that is because they are waiting for some cushy job in the EU. But I'm not sure I buy that. Although, having said that, I am given pause for thought by the fact that around 75 MPs, and that's more than 1 in 10, remember, have had the whips removed, formed new parties or changed parties, many more than once, and as far as I'm aware, not a single one has had the guts to face the judgment of their constituents. So maybe they're only in it for the money theory has more weight to it than I realised. But nevertheless, I'm still not convinced. I mean, would you sell out your country for a cushy job in Brussels? Would you really? I mean, I can see that one might be tempted, so long as it was never revealed. But for it to be on show for all to see, this to me at least remains a mystery. But as I say, it is not the most important matter at hand. What is important is that they seem prepared to do anything to get what they want. With the caveat that none of them seem to want to risk their taxpayer-funded salary, of course. But that aside, their commitment to prevent us from leaving the EU seems almost fanatical. We grumble in pubs and whine on Twitter. We sign petitions and go on marches when we can. But them, they seem to be prepared to go down in the history books as minor quizzlings to get what they want. I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that for all the money in the world. And yet they seem to. The kindest and most charitable explanation is that they must really, really, really think that Brexit will be such a disaster that they must do anything they can to stop it. And if that really is the reason for their behaviour, then it at least will be a mitigating factor in the judgment of history. But my position has always been that as the people are, as they should be, the final arbiter of decision-making in a functioning democracy, the agency for this decision is ours and not theirs. It belongs to us. And it's still ours, even if they're right. Even if they're right that Brexit will turn out to be the most catastrophic blunder, it's still our decision, because that's how grown-ups operate. They make decisions and then live by the consequences. And taking again that their motivation is of that most charitable kind, it necessarily comes with the most astonishing lack of confidence. And this lack of confidence is also mystifying. Although we must all guard against the folly of believing in our own national exceptional brilliance, by the same token, it is equally foolish to believe that we are uniquely incapable of making a reasonable fist of Brexit. There is no evidence whatsoever that we are unable to shoulder the burden of running our own affairs. It's true that most of our trade is with the EU, but all of our profitable trade is with countries outside the EU. There have been many scare stories, usually involving chlorinated chicken, about a predatory United States, but we actually operate a massive trade surplus with the US. More trade really is good for both countries. Good for us since we operate a trade surplus, and good for the US as they will try to level that up. In the meantime, that means more prosperity for us and for them. As Rees-Mogg was so fond of saying, we shouldn't be afraid of no deal. But what we should also not be afraid of is of letting the Remain side that we also will do anything to get what we want. Fortunately for us, due to the much overdue forthcoming general election, our task is much simpler. Now that the battle lines are drawn and Parliament can no longer defy the people, all we have to do is engage in the democratic process. We don't have to co-opt the Supreme Court. We don't have to invent anti-democratic convolutions like the Ben Act until our brains ache. We don't have to employ the media to make sly remarks impugning our intelligence or our motivations. All we have to do is vote. And we can do that, can't we? Of course, it's not in the same league as storming the Normandy beaches. It's not the same as screwing your fear down tight as you climb into a bomb-laden Lancaster night after night. It's nowhere near the same ballpark as crewing an unarmed merchantman across a U-boat infested North Atlantic. The resolution required is chicken feed compared to those that came before us. But if we can't get what we want using the democracy that they bequeathed us, and since the referendum I know that's still an open question, we might yet have to up our game. The Remainers remain determined. We need to be more so.